Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Mike Marinacci. His last name is spelled Marinacci, and he has just published a book, really fascinating book. Title of the book is Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches, LSD, Cannabis, and Spiritual Sacraments in Underground America. And this is not his first book. He published in 2018, Erie, California, Strange Places and Odd Phenomena in the Golden State. And then I think his first book in 2016 was California Jesus, a slightly irreverent guide to the Golden State's Christian sects, evangelists, and Latter-day Prophets. And he has done a lot of research in this book. He's been researching this topic for many decades. He actually talked with one of my guests, Carl Hassel, and we went over the Peyote Way Church of God sect that's involved. That's actually a chapter in this book, but it was interesting to see Carl mentioned in this book. But I think it's a very timely book, and I think it ties into a lot of things that are going on in the culture. Mike writes about this entheogenic revival, and I think that's still in people's minds in the culture, and we were just talking about other names and places that are happening right now. So I think that this is all very important material. So Mike Marinacci, welcome to the show.
Thank you, William. I'm happy to be here and discuss the book.
Yeah, you just published it July 4th, 2023. Today's the 15th. So can you kind of talk about your background? I know that you spent a lot of time researching this, and you're in kind of the Northern California area where a lot of this stuff is and a lot of people are. Maybe you can just talk about putting the book together.
Well, I grew up in Southern California, actually, and was raised more or less secular humanist. And when I went off to college, I started experimenting with entheogens and had some very profound experiences on psilocybin and LSD, which I interpreted as religious or spiritual revelations. And they stuck with me. And then years later, I became very interested in alternative spirituality and sort of underground religions and groups, churches, sects, cults you don't normally hear about. And I found out that there was a whole family of groups that were formed to create communities of people that share the psychedelic experience. Now, the problem was this was the mid-late 80s when I discovered all this stuff, and that was really the high tide of the Reagan-Bush war on drugs. And these groups were either defunct or very, very underground and very cautious about who they reached out to. So I was only able to get a very limited amount of information about them. And then in the next decade, when we had the sort of beginning of the psychedelic renaissance with Terence McKenna and Robert Anton Wilson and people like that, it got more above ground and you started seeing new groups emerging. And then I started collecting more data about them and talking to the founders of some of these groups and actually doing some participant observer work with them. And then finally, just a couple of years ago, I looked at this mass of information I'd collected over the years, and I said, well, there's a book here. A friend of mine who is a freelance acquisitions editor got me a contract with Inner Traditions, they're pretty much the metaphysical subjects book publisher in North America. And I produced the book, Psychedelic Churches, Cults and Outlaw Churches. It's based on, I'd say, over 30 years of research and a lot of very deep digging and a lot of reaching out to some pretty colorful people, if obscure. And it really tells the story of this religious underground in North America where cannabis and LSD and psilocybin and peyote and other psychoactive substances are treated as the sacraments of their churches, as the way that the people involved come together as a community and seek the divine through the use of these substances.
Right. And so these substances were indigenous. So there's a kind of a thread through your book of these kind of the European people contacting these older indigenous people for these drugs such as peyote
Certainly in
and
North America.
psilocybin.
Yeah. Peyote has been used in North America for at least 7,000 years. Psilocybin probably goes back as far, but that was more of something that was in Mexico and was rediscovered in the mid 50s by a man named R. Gordon Wasson, who he and his wife contacted a curandera there named Maria Sabina, who turned them on to the secrets of the psilocybe mushroom, and then the word got out from there. As far as peyote, that's really been more the American and Canadian indigenous entheogen. Peyote usage really got going in the U.S. in the wake of the so-called ghost dance movement among the Indians and the Wounded Knee Massacre, when it was obvious that they'd been completely conquered by the colonists after 4 centuries, and America's indigenous people said, "Okay, what's next? What do we need to keep our hope alive and to keep up our identity as Indians and give us a vision for the future?" And so peyote meetings started spreading throughout the American tribes, and an anthropologist named James Mooney, a white anthropologist who was very sympathetic to the Indians and to the peyotists, said, now that you're in the United States, you're under the protections of the Constitution, and a prime one for the citizens is the First Amendment, which allows freedom of religious practice. What you need to do is incorporate all these peyote circles and little groups as a church. And so in 1918, the Native American Church was incorporated in Oklahoma, and then spent the next 75 years fighting in various courts, federal, state, and tribal, for their right to consume peyote in ceremony as a holy sacrament. And finally, after many, many years of struggle, in 1994, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act amendments passed and allowed anybody who was an enrolled member of a Native American tribe and could prove 1/4 or more Native American ancestry to be part of the Native American Church, and peyote would be allowed to them in this sacred context. For everybody else, it's still a Schedule I federal crime to possess or cultivate or use it. And things really kind of went from there. The active psychedelic ingredient of peyote, of course, is mescaline. And then in 1954, Aldous Huxley had his bestseller about his mescaline trips called The Doors of Perception. And that awakened a lot of popular interest in it, along with R. Gordon Wasson's sort of discovery of psilocybin for the non-Mexican indigenous world. Then you had also the invention of LSD in the 1940s by Albert Hofmann, and its marketing as a sort of psychological wonder drug to psychiatrists and MDs in the Western world. And that LSD, of course, was the great popularizer of it for non-clinical uses, of course, was Timothy Leary, whose career I discuss in length in Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches. And then you had the tied-in phenomenon of cannabis being used as a sacrament. Certainly in the old world, in Asia and certain parts of Europe and certain parts of Africa, there is records of the use of cannabis as for mind expansion and spiritual growth. And we in the 1930s in the U.S., of course, we had the whole reefer madness panic, which really shunted it to the far fringes of American culture. But then it was rediscovered by the beatniks in the 50s, and then the hippie culture in the 60s, and really became so closely identified with the hippie culture and with the hippie culture's interest in using psychoactives for consciousness expansion that it became part of the family of of mind-expanding psychoactives that we call entheogens. And there have been churches and sects and cults established around its use in a sacred context too. And I go into them in psychedelic cults and outlaw churches.
Right. And can you kind of go into some of those that used cannabis as kind of a sacrament or an entheogen?
Well, in many ways, the original one would have been, at least in this part of the world, would have been the Rastafarians, who started around the 1950s in Jamaica and kind of spread through the Caribbean among the African diaspora population there. They saw Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia as sort of a second coming and the great black savior that had been predicted by people like Marcus Garvey. And they used what they call ganja as or cannabis as a sacrament in their rites. Ganja had been brought to Jamaica in the 19th century by Asian Indian immigrants and workers. And the group I'm most interested in psychedelic cults and outlaw churches there is the Ethiopian Zion Coptic Church, who were the first of these Rastafarian, what they call houses in Jamaica, to reach out to white people and say black and white must unite. We need to both be consuming the sacrament and leading these very straight-laced Old Testament biblical lifestyles and living communally and seeing Haile Selassie as our great prophet if we are going to overthrow Babylon, which is basically the White West, and create a new world, a new righteous and holy world. They inspired a lot of people. And then there were also groups that just kind of, that came from other sources. One very interesting one that I get into in psychedelic cults and outlaw churches was called the Shiva Fellowship. They were started by a man named Willie Minzy in San Francisco. He had gone east to India on the hippie trail in the 60s and had, when he was in India, he started hanging out with the sadhus, and there was a faction of these Hindu holy men who worshiped the god Shiva and used ganja sacramentally there. And he was initiated into their order and vowed to bring worship of Shiva through cannabis back to the US. And he set up a group in San Francisco called the Shiva Fellowship. And for a couple of years, they would have these very large open ceremonies in Golden Gate Park in the city, where cannabis was openly smoked, and they were generally tolerated by the law until he and some of his associates started pushing things a bit. He was eventually busted there for providing narcotics to a minor because apparently one preteen kid had gotten a hold of a joint at one of these ceremonies and started smoking it. He was sent away, and then the Shiva Fellowship spun off into another much more radical group called the Psychedelic Venus Church, led by his lieutenant, Jefferson Poland, who was a very famous New Left activist and founder of the Sexual Freedom League. And he combined sacramental use of cannabis with goddess worship, focus on Venus and Kali and Aphrodite and all these female divine figures, and also body positivity and sacred sex rites and quasi-tantric practices. And I have a big chapter about them in Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches. They were just wild group, and their story has never really been told until now.
Yeah, I've never heard of that. I've never heard of either of them. And they were in the whole Haight-Ashbury late 60s kind of cultural explosion in San Francisco, right?
Oh, yeah. And Berkeley was really their stronghold, but they had a lot of things going on in San Francisco where they would stage these, quote, ceremonies, end quote, which were basically psychedelic, these Dionysian psychedelic rock dances where the bands and everybody in the audience would be nude and everybody would be tripping on LSD spiked punch, and there'd be orgies happening in some rooms. I mean, just really crazy stuff. I mean, it's and I'd say a lot of this stuff kind of planted the seeds for what we have now with Burning Man and raves and things like that. I mean, this is a fairly old phenomenon. This thing of having these ecstatic group experiences on entheogens that many people interpret as having spiritual significance and growing them spiritually. And that's really kind of the thread I've followed in psychedelic cults and outlaw churches.
Right. And so they were kind of around at that time. Ginsburg. When was the Human Being? That was 67.
67, January 67. And that was, of course, there's footage you can see on YouTube of Timothy Leary speaking at that and then issuing his great soundbite, turn on, tune in, and drop out. That was in many ways kind of the high point of the original hippie culture. And then it just kind of exploded from there into the rest of America and the Western world. And it still, I think, is influencing world culture and music and fashion and spirituality. And really so much of that is tied into the psychedelic experience and into the then, until late 1966, LSD was legal in the United States, and it was being used by a lot of people, and many of them were saying, I've had this spiritual breakthrough on this chemical. And they would find each other and start these little groups centered on the communal use of LSD, and then, of course, later cannabis, and then they discovered peyote through the American Indians, and psilocybin once people figured out how easy it is to fruit the mushrooms that contain it. And it is an ongoing phenomenon, and in many ways, I think it's gotten bigger than ever because of the increasing mainstream attention on and respectability of entheogens now. I mean, last month in Denver, they had the huge MAPS conference there. 12,000 people showed up to that conference to discuss all the aspects of the psychedelic culture and its use for therapy and indigenous history and practices. It is bigger than ever. It just seems to be one of these things that it's like John Barleycorn. You keep trying to kill him, he just keeps coming back and getting stronger.
Right. The interest has never waned. And I think that being was important too, because I think the Grateful Dead played there too. So that's another kind of this cultural musical thing you mentioned.
Yeah, it was a bunch of things. It was really the counterculture coalescing. It was Leary, the Dead, and the Jefferson Airplane representing music. Allen Ginsberg and Lenore Kandel was the author of the Love Poem, representing literature. Jerry Rubin for political militancy. It was all these things, this gathering that just was so key, and that just kind of things from there just exploded and went all over the world. And that was really ground zero, as was the hate, until it really began to decay in late 67 and early 68. And even then it was still a hot spot. I mean, that's where the Shiva Fellowship really came out of the post Summer of Love hate and kept a lot of things going there.
Right. No, it is fascinating. And I think an interesting aspect of this whole cults and these outlaw churches is how they maneuvered around the law, right? So you had these other groups you mentioned, the Orange Sunshine Conspiracy, Leary himself. Like, what? I mean, there's a lot of interesting things they had to do to try to not end up in jail forever, right? I mean, even Leary, right? He got busted for
Well, the defense they always used was based on the one that had been originated with the Native American Church. This is our First Amendment right under freedom of religion. We are using these substances as our sacraments to address our God or our prime mover, or whatever you want to call it, in our way and grow spiritually. And they should not be prohibited to us if we use them in this context. Now, they didn't have much luck in the 60s and 70s and 80s using this argument, but things have been changing recently. There have been more courts now that are making very limited and guarded rulings saying, yes, if you are an adult who is sincerely religious and is using these in that context, we're not going to overthrow the laws about them, but we're not going to prosecute you for it either. It's kind of moving into a gray area. Was a good case a couple of years ago about one of the groups I cover in psychedelic cults and outlaw churches called the Oratory of Mystical Sacraments. They're kind of intriguing in that instead of using indigenous symbolism and rites or Eastern Buddhist Hindu stuff or neo-pagan goddess worship, they're very much interested in alchemy and Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry and these very Western, hermetic, kind of left brain forms of consciousness expansion. And one of their members was busted in New Hampshire for possession of psilocybin. And he fought the bust in court, and it went to the state Supreme Court there. And the state Supreme Court ruled, yes, this is a legitimate religious path, and he's sincere, and he shouldn't be prosecuted for possession here. Now, the problem with that ruling was it only applies in New Hampshire, but it was rather surprising to see a state Supreme Court come out with that. It is an indication, I think, that things are changing now, that this is being more recognized in jurisprudence, in a limited fashion, of course, but things are loosening up.
Yeah, it is interesting, but that's why they had to be outlaws, right? Because at that time, they'd go to jail forever. Like, I think that was a huge. Can you talk about the Orange Sunshine, the Brotherhood of Eternal Love?
Well, the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, very interesting group, and a couple of very good full-length books have been written about them. They sort of originated in Orange County, California in the early and mid 60s as these basically hoodlum greasers and stoner surfers who started doing LSD and realized that there's a lot more to this life than boosting hubcaps and catching waves, and said, we're giving up our criminal lives. We're going to become a brotherhood, a holy brotherhood that is dedicated to turning on the world to LSD. Now, they financed themselves by dealing cannabis and later hashish that was smuggled in from Latin America and Asia. But much of the acid that they distributed, which included Orange Sunshine, which was developed under their under their aegis and became kind of a brand name of LSD in the late 60s. Much of it they just distributed free because they saw this as their calling to turn on the world. They would go to concerts or counterculture parties or events and just give out fistfuls of these little orange pills. They got in a lot of trouble on an international level because so much of what they were doing was global based, both in the smuggling and the vending and distribution. And they were, by the 70s, they'd really kind of lost a lot of the idealistic earlier vision, and they were dealing cocaine along with everything else. And that at that point, the U.S. and other governments were really stomping down on them and busting their leaders and members and sending them away for long prison sentences. And I get into their long and rather complex story in psychedelic cults and outlaw churches. They're still around as a sort of symbolic organization. The old brothers many of them are still out there writing their own memoirs and doing documentaries. And I know several of them. And one of the funny things about them is they inevitably, when they're asked about the Brotherhood, they say, well, yeah, I was a member from the early days. I knew Farmer John Griggs, who was the founder. I was there. That other guy, he's fake. I don't know him. He was never with us. And then you go to the other guy and he says the same thing. It's very there's this kind of rivalry about who is true brotherhood and who isn't.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I did an interview with McDonough, who wrote a book about William Pickard. So I was kind
Oh,
of familiar kind of with some of those
yeah.
people in that environment. But Pickard says that there was an underground group of like 6 or 8 guys who were responsible for creating most of the psychedelics in the world, or something crazy like that. I forgot the name of his book, but
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So, but yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and then of course in Britain in the 70s there was the whole Operation Julie case where you had just a handful of chemists that were producing these insane amounts of LSD that were going all over Europe and into other parts of the world, and that was really kind of what stimulated the original interest in the Brotherhood of Eternal Love among researchers and writers, was because there was a book called the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, which came out in Britain, not the USA, in the late 70s, early 80s, and looked at the connections that the Brotherhood and the Julie chemists in England and Wales had with each other. That it was this like international conspiracy, again, to turn on the world through lysergic acid.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. Like how, and now it's like you see this opening of the psychedelic. It's still, the interest is still there, but it seems like unlike marijuana, California, I mean,
Yeah.
incredible. Like, and it
Yeah.
the sky didn't fall once it got
Yeah.
legalized. So,
Yeah.
right.
And it's really fascinating how quickly it has become mainstream and how acceptable it is now, because I'm 62 years old. I remember back in my still by my adolescence, it was mere possession was still a felony, and then they passed a law in California that said, okay, if you're caught with 1 ounce or less, it's just a civil offense, and you're fined $100. And then things kind of progressed from there. And then, of course, by the mid 90s in the state, you had legal medicinal cannabis, and then you had the complete across the board legalization 20 years later. And other states, of course, have followed suit. Nevada and Colorado were the first, but now I think it's something like 37 states have either completely legal, or medicinal is legal, or just very, very reduced penalties. I think only 13 states are left that where mere possession is still a criminal offense.
Right. But it was pretty edgy back in those days, 60s, 70s.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And also underground money. So you had
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
this outlaw element to it.
Yeah. And I need to really qualify the two of the words I used in the titles of Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches. When I use the word cults, I'm using it in the original meaning for religious sociologists, meaning a new, non-orthodox, non-mainstream religious group. The word cult started becoming pejorative after Jonestown. And what I'm trying to do is reclaim it, really, and just say it shouldn't have the baggage attached to it that's been laid on it, associating that word with really evil groups like People's Temple or Heaven's Gate or what have you. Now, the word outlaw, as in outlaw churches, there's a difference between being an outlaw and a criminal. A criminal is a murderer, a rapist, a thief, somebody who is committing acts that all societies deem forbidden because they're deeply destructive to individuals and to the social order. An outlaw is somebody who is violating laws of a particular time and place in society, knows they're violating them, and chooses to kind of remain in this position where they're vulnerable. I would say in the Middle Ages, being not being a member of the Catholic Church in Europe would make you an outlaw. If you were in the U.S. in the 1850s and working in the Underground Railroad freeing slaves, you were an outlaw. It's a big distinction between the two. I am not saying these churches and individuals in psychedelic cults and outlaw churches are criminal in any way, although much of what they're doing is legally prohibited. It's just that they're standing against the laws of this particular time and place in society regarding the use of psychoactive chemicals.
Right. And there is kind of an element of kind of like people pushing the boundaries. Leary had people around him
Yeah.
like the Millbrook guy, what was his name?
Art Kleps.
Yeah, Kleps.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Can you talk about him?
Oh, really fascinating character. Well, like Leary, Kleps was a former psychologist and World War II era veteran and from the Northeast and from a fairly straight-laced background. His dad was a Lutheran pastor. And he actually turned on to psychedelics months before Leary did. He tried mescaline in early 1960 and had an incredible experience. And then 3 months later, I think Leary had his first trip on psilocybin mushrooms in Mexico. And then 3 years later, when the Millbrook Commune was established in upstate New York at this palatial old mansion near Poughkeepsie, he heard about it and joined Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, later to become Ram Dass there, and kind of had a falling out with some of the other locals and said, I'm going to form my own organization. I'm going to call it the Neo-American Church. And we're going to be very serious about using cannabis and LSD as sacraments, and we were going to fight in the courts for it. But our own view of ourselves as in the church, we don't want to get too institutionalized. We don't want to get all serious and hidebound and straight-laced like every other organized religion that's out there. Let's make it fun. So he deliberately put these absurdist elements into the church. I mean, ministers of the church are called boohoos. The symbol of the church is a three-eyed toad, which is, of course, is a reference to psychedelic toads and bufotenin. The church hymns were "Row, row, row your boat" and "Puff the Magic Dragon." The sacred church key was a bottle opener. There was this very kind of Dada element he put into it to reflect, I think, the playful side of the psychedelic experience, and also to keep it from becoming just another boring old religious institution. And very smart guy, very, very skilled author, but also, like many people, if not most people in this underground, this sort of demimonde that I'm describing in psychedelic cults and outlaw churches, kind of messed up. Alcoholic, became a tranquilizer addict. Very, very difficult man to deal with, from my own experiences and from the experience of other people who've worked with him or lived with him. Leary, certainly, if you read Robert Greenfield's biography, does not come off very favorably much of the time as a person. Jefferson Poland of the Psychedelic Venus Church, who I was talking about earlier, I get into his gross dysfunctions in psychedelic cults and outlaw churches. Normal people, well-adjusted people, high-functioning people who really fit perfectly into the society do not start new religions. That's just been the case, I think, from day one. It's always been outlaw country. It's always been where people who are a little off, who are misfits, who are strange visionaries go. I think that's just the nature of what we're talking about here. And of course, when you mix in this mind expanding psychoactives to a religion, then you're really in new territory and unfamiliar territory. Although, if one looks at the history of human civilization and human religiosity, there's drugs at the very beginning, whether they be the soma of the ancient Aryans in the Hindu culture, or cannabis in various places. And there's a really good book out there by Brian Murarescu, a bestseller, called The Immortality Key, where he finds all this evidence in the old world Abrahamic sects, particularly the ancient Hebrews and very early Christianity, of them turning on with various substances as part of their religious rites. So, in one sense, it's very very avant-garde and new certainly in North American civilization, modern post-indigenous. On the other hand, it's very primal. This is something that just seems to be there at the beginning in a lot of places.
Yeah, it's around ancient Greece as well. There's all kinds of stories of them doing
Oh yeah,
drugs. And
yeah,
even the Romans had like they licked a specific fish. I forgot
yeah,
what it was, but they would try to get high off certain stuff. So
yeah,
it's been
yeah.
around. I think that really what was very curious is you went from the staid post-war 50s into the 60s where these drugs went around, and it created
Yeah.
this explosion of these different
Yeah.
drugs and cultures and cults
Mhm.
and different churches. I mean, it's
Yeah.
really amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's a real learning process because these are people who were kind of like the psychedelic forebears, people who experimented. So you can kind of see
Mhm.
what came out of all this stuff. And we're at kind of a different chapter, a different kind of cultural phase than the 60s now.
Yeah.
Where,
Yeah. Well, much more is known
yes.
about them now, even though so much research was prohibited because of Schedule One strictures. There has been a lot of pharmacological research, chemical research, and of course psychological since the 60s. And I was talking to an interviewer the other day, and he said, yeah, it's different now because we were talking about the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. He says, yeah, back then it was just, throwing out handfuls of orange sunshine tablets. Oh, yeah, everybody should try this. Everybody should turn on. Everybody. And now it's more, no, it's, we need to be more controlled. We need to be more careful and more mindful of what we're doing, because this is playing with dynamite a lot of the time. There's a reason these are life-changing substances, and there is definitely potential for abuse with them. So what we're working out now at things like that MAPS conference last month and in other communities is, okay, how do we approach this experience? How do we make sure that what we're using is what people say it is? And what do we do during the experience, and how do we integrate this experience into our lives once we're back on the ground? I know that one of the best things Larry ever said was the whole importance of three things: set, setting, and dosage. Set is your where your mind is, where your consciousness and psychology is, your sort of internal state when you take a psychoactive. Setting is your environment. Where are you in space, time? What's happening around you? Who are you with? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, dosage is what exactly are you getting and how much of it are you using? You've got to be very conscious of those three things, I think, when you are using any entheogen.
Right. And even the standard drugs of today, alcohol, those are very important. Those three settings are important as well. So
Absolutely.
even illegal stuff, yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I mean, it's incredible. LSD now, people are doing it. It's associated with the tech environment. People are microdosing.
Yeah.
So it's just It's just
Yeah.
turned into a kaleidoscope of uses and approaches and things. I
Mhm.
mean, it even comes
Yeah.
into DNA. Like the guy who figured out the PCR test said he was
Mhm.
on acid, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's on LSD.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah. One thing I always like to, it's my paraphrased quote when I'm talking about the difference between, say, mere recreational use and mind-changing use of cannabis, which can be used for both. I always like to paraphrase what a saying attributed to Mickey Spillane about beer. My paraphrase would be: anyone who can't have a psychedelic experience on cannabis isn't trying. It's, again, setting, and dosage. You can either have a good party or you can really uh, expand your mind quite a bit and have this the spiritual growth that I talk about in psychedelic cults and outlaw churches.
yeah, I mean, great conversation, really interesting book, thoroughly researched.
Mhm.
You've done years of study. I mean, what is there anything you'd like to add when we wrap this up, or anything I missed?
Well, in psychedelic cults and outlaw churches, I've pretty much kept my own judgments out of it. I've just laid out the stories of these groups as I've been able to put them together from my own research and interviews and experiences. And I don't make any claims. in the book about which groups and leaders and figures are legitimate and which of them are probably scams or just, and whether I also do not advocate or oppose the use of any of these substances. I think it's something that intelligent, responsible adults have to make their own decisions about how and when and why they are going to expand their internal consciousness in any way. So I've tried to stay as objective as I can and just tell the stories as they are, and let readers decide when they read Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches, is this legitimate? Is this not? What's really going on here?
There's a lot of people I'd never heard of. I haven't heard of the guy was Mooney or the Aitken families. Like some of these people are not as colorful as Leary or something. Maybe history hasn't done them a proper service. So I think you did that service and included them in this. Where's the best place to get this book, Mike?
You can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, any of the usual outlets. If your local bookstore doesn't have it, have them special order it for you. You can find me on Instagram. You can find it on Facebook. I'm just going out there and trying to tell as many people as I can about it, because it really is my literary and pop sociology baby, and I'm trying to get it to grow and flourish and really instruct and entertain people regarding this whole religious underground and subculture.
Right. So you've got it on Kindle and paperback right now.
Oh yeah, it's on Kindle. You can read it on your tablet.
And where's the best place for people to contact you if they want to follow up or have any additional questions?
Okay. I would say the best way would be my email, which is mike@psychedeliccults, that's all one word, .com.
Mike at psychedeliccults.com. I'll put that on there. Do you have a website, Mike? I didn't even check.
Yeah, there is the psychedeliccults.com website, but I haven't really populated it yet. I've been been busy with so many other things here that I will eventually get some materials onto them. I do have a pretty good Instagram page for it. If you look on Instagram for Psychedelic Cults, it's got filled with photos and illustrations that I couldn't use in the book for technical or legal purposes. That pertain to these groups and psychedelic cults and outlaw churches, and some are quite amusing and striking.
I'll find that Instagram page. I will put a link to that. I will also put a link to your email.
Okay.
And again, the author's name is Mike Marinacci, and the title of the book is Psychedelic Cults and Outlaw Churches, LSD, Cannabis, and Spiritual Sacraments in Underground America. Just published July 4th, 2023. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, William. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise.